As the officers were standing together in front of one of the commercial establishments on that street, a male, who has not yet been positively identified, charged at the officers with a hatchet in his hand. Unprovoked and not speaking a word, the male then swung at one of the officers with the hatchet, striking his right arm. After striking that officer, the suspect continued swinging the hatchet, striking a second officer in the head, causing him to fall to the sidewalk.
With almost the speed of blinding light, the words were splashed across websites and certain broadcast networks. The man who attacked a police officer in New York City with a hatchet was, and I quote, an apparent Muslim suspect. And one morning cable news wag said there was no doubt. It was obvious this was connected to Islamic terrorism. What is obvious is we have a deranged whack job with a hatchet. The rest relies on investigation, and that's where some common sense needs to come into play. Let's welcome to MidPoint former advisor to the House Homeland Security Commission and a former CIA covert officer, Joshua Katz. Josh, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Ed. It's good to be back with you.
Josh, what is it that has made us so knee-jerky? I mean, and of course, you talked, and I just mentioned a couple of things here when it comes down to the American cable networks and certainly what's on the web, and you can't trust what's on the web in the first place. But why is it now that we are not willing to wait for evidence to come up, but every time something happens, bang, Islamic terrorism?
You know, Ed, I think your opening there was incredibly spot on. You know, the knee-jerk reaction here is we're still jittery from Ottawa this week, right? And we're trying to make connections that aren't necessarily there. You know, as I've been saying for a while, there is a fine line between insanity and terrorism. And here, we don't know yet. The evidence is not in. We do know that this male has a history of violence. We know that his website has Islamic prayer on it, but that doesn't make him a terrorist. So we need to look and to wait for the connections that are going to come out of the FBI and other intelligence organizations that are going to really say, was this a motivation based on connections to Islamic radicals? Was this something that was driving him mentally? What exactly was this?
Is it not fair to say that we are a nation right now where law enforcement tells us be vigilant? They want us as individuals to make sure that we're constantly watching what happens, be aware of our surroundings, as my dad taught me so many years ago, growing up in New York City, as a matter of fact. But is it not fair to say that this doesn't do investigations any good whatsoever when you have people just knee-jerking, and the public, because when they see the tiniest little things, anything, they're now willing to say, got to be terrorism, got to be Islamic, and it's like, doesn't it hurt the investigation when you're getting that from people, and that's the perception that comes across?
Well, Ed, I think that there's a lot of things that it hurts. I think initially our federal government has not done a good job of defining to the American people what terrorism is. I think also it hurts in the fact that we as a nation no longer look around us. You know, most of us, and I'm guilty of this, as probably you are, Ed, of, you know, having my head in the cell phone all the time, but that doesn't help our vigilance. We really do need to be vigilant, but what are we vigilant for? We need to be vigilant for much more than just terrorism, because terrorism happens very infrequently. We need to be more vigilant for the average everyday crimes. And, you know, unfortunately, New York and other major cities see crimes all the time. This is a violent act against police officers, and we need to get to the bottom of it. But we should not jump to any conclusions here on what the person's motivation is, and we may not really ever know what the motivation was.
Is it worthwhile saying that, and again, we look at what's been talked about and what's on Facebook, but saying it out louder, about a minute or so we have left, just because you have Islamic paraphernalia posted on a Facebook, just because you say Allah Akbar, or you have yourself posing in some sort of garb that might indicate that you're Islamic, does not necessarily mean that a whack job or a nutcase is doing it because of his or her love for a religious faith.
And that's a great question, Ed. And it boils down to, are they doing it because it's going to be a press-fulfilling way to go out of this life? Or are they doing it because of faith? And I think it's the failure to identify that terrorism really is, at least modern day terrorism, it has a root in Islamic jihad. And it's calling it what it is, right? So if we are able to identify that it's Islamic radicals who are doing it based on a faith-based approach, then I think we can more clearly identify what's going on and what cases are what. But until we do that, people are going to have these knee-jerk reactions to a lot of things.
But do not discount the fact that, again, it is possible, correct?
Absolutely is.
And you always have to look at all the sides, and please don't pay a lot of attention to the guys who are sitting on the couches in the mornings and say that something is obvious when obviously they have no investigative background whatsoever and all they're looking to do is make for conversation. How's that?
That's a great point, Ed.
There you go. Josh, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, after the break, we'll dig into yet another moment of covered-up hubris in American academics, or rather athletics, because in some places there's no winning games without fraud. And at the 51-minute mark after the hour news call,